I'm Jay Solomon,
And I'm Hagar Chemali.
and welcome to the Threat Podcast. Every week, we'll analyze and discuss the most pressing, yet not always so visible, threats to global security and the movements and ideologies that fuel extremism and terrorism.
We'll take listeners to the front lines of these battles, both at home and abroad, and we'll talk with the key players in law enforcement, intelligence, diplomacy, and academia who are working to counter these threats. Welcome to The Threat. I'm Hagar Chemali.
And I'm Jay Solomon.
Today we're going to discuss the extremely fluid situation in Cuba, where at the moment, the Trump administration is massively increasing economic pressure on the island nation's communist government. And last week, even indicted on murder charges the country's 94-year-old military ruler, Raul Castro. CIA Director John Ratcliffe also visited Havana last week and essentially presented the Cuban government with an ultimatum. Either open up your economic and political systems or prepare for even more American financial and military coercion. So is the Cuban regime about to fall after nearly 70 years in power? Could the U.S. be building up for a military operation to dislodge the Castros? Could the Trump administration replicate in Cuba what it just executed in Venezuela by finding a new leader from within the system? To discuss all this, we're thrilled to have on the Threat Podcast Gelet Martinez Fragela, one of the most astute observers on all things Cuba and the Castros. Gelet is an investigative journalist and the CEO of the Digital News Association, which is a nonprofit focused on the intersection of technology and media to promote human rights in closed societies. She is also the founder of ADN Cuba, a news platform that reports on human rights violations in Cuba and has even been blocked on the island, which it sounds like is a badge of honor. She joins us from Boca Raton, Florida. Gelet, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's kick it off we'll start with the beginning. Last week, we'll start with the latest news. Last week, CIA Director John Ratcliffe visited Havana and offered basically an ultimatum to the Cuban regime, as we mentioned. And we've moved now a U.S. aircraft carrier strike group, the USS Nimitz, off the Cuban coast. Gelet, do you think we're headed for a conflict?
I think we're already in conflict, right? But I would be careful not to assume war is inevitable. I think that's exactly what the United States is trying to prevent. What we've been seeing is coercive pressure. I think this is another message that the administration is sending to the regime, telling them we are not going to look the other way like we have done in the past. Last week, we also saw that they arrested the sister of the lady that leads the GAESA. GAESA is this big military conglomerate that has 80%, controls 85% of the Cuban economy, all the hotels, the investments. And her sister was living here. She owned real estate companies. And for many years, we have been, trying to raise awareness about all these kids and relatives of big generals that are in the United States that act as figurehead of the Cuban regime, entities that belong to the Cuban regime to circumvent sanctions. And there hasn't been the political will to actually take action. What we see now is the U.S. is increasingly taking action against these people in many different ways to put pressure and avoid, in my opinion, an escalation to this conflict.
What steps is the Cuban government taking in response to this pressure? I've read articles about them buying attack drones from the Chinese or the Iranians or the Russians, or maybe all three of them. You hear stories of the Cuban Communist government sort of mobilizing people on the ground. Is that what's happening, or is it overblown that there's some sort of, I don't know if you say a military response or some really active response?
No, there is active response. That's not a secret. The Cuban regime is responding the way it always does, right? There is definitely mobilization inside the country. They're doing military exercises every single day. It appears in Cuban press, and this is not new. This is something that is happening every single day. They're mobilizing people, but I think it's also an internal message, trying to maintain the population thinking we're in control. don't get crazy, don't take the streets, because they're very afraid of another July 11. July 11 was the biggest protest that we've seen in the history of communist Cuba. It was a nationwide protest that happened in 2021, and they're very afraid of something like that happening under the circumstances in this scenario. So they're trying to control the population. Now, are they really that crazy to think they can have a military confrontation with the United States? I think that's the big question. So you see the rhetoric coming from the regime every single day on the press. So that's definitely a reality. Is it something just for the Cuban people? That we'll have to wait and see. I hope it's only to scare the Cuban people and they don't try to really face the United States in another way, because obviously they're going to lose, but they're going to expose a lot of innocent people.
Gelet, so you've talked about the tools the Castro regime is using to try and hang on. How fragile do you see them? I mean, how long do you think that they could hold on for?
Well, the regime is extremely fragile, right, economically, and obviously politically inside the island. Nobody really believes they can improve the situation. Nobody believes on that system anymore. I keep telling people only 5% of the Cuban population are registered on the Communist Party. In a country where there's only one party, it's a one-party system. In a country where actually joining the ranks of the Communist Party is almost mandatory, because there are a lot of jobs that you cannot have access to if you don't belong to the Communist Party. Aside from all of that, its survival tools internally are very strong. You know, they're very good at repressing people. They're very good at intelligence penetration around the world. So they claim that, for example, they have over 2,000 assets inside the United States, that they have ears at all levels of government. So they're going to hear whatever it is that the U.S. government is planning so they can mitigate. That's what they would say to Maduro. And obviously it didn't work out, because the reality is that they can't, if the U.S. is serious about this, they're not going to be able to hold into power. What they're trying to do and the tools they're trying to implement is just trying to win time. And they're also going to leverage their foreign alliances and their propaganda. But I think it's very clear now that there are not a lot of people, of countries even coming into the rescue, because the human rights violations that they have committed for the past few decades. I don't think the world is at a point where they're going to come and save the Cuban regime from its fate. The only way they're going to stay in power if it's the United States loses track from this goal and changes its goal. But as long as the United States goal is to have regime change in Cuba, whatever we want to call it, but to really try to change the situation in Cuba, if that's the goal of the US, it's going to happen. They don't have any resource to answer to that, to the amount of actually tools that the United States have, but they were not using all the tools at their disposal.
Gelet, can you take us back a bit? Like, people might say, why do we even care about the Cuban regime? But can you take us back a bit? Because for a country that small, over the last, certainly from the Cold War on, they've been very active, sort of punching above their weight. They sent troops into Africa to back Angola in its fight with the South African regime. They helped overthrow the Somoza government in 1979. Just give a bit of a picture about just how active, not just in Latin America, but globally, such a small country has been. And are they still, I guess with the Venezuela situation, that kind of regional influence ebbed, but it would be great just to give listeners that historical background.
Yes, definitely. Well, Cuba was never just a small Caribbean dictatorship. It was a Soviet-trained export platform of anti-Western revolution, and they were very efficient at it. Right? There is a lot of bibliography that goes back to what the Cubans would do in Latin America. For example, the Cubans will help the guerrillas in Colombia and the drug trafficking industry to kidnap American businessmen to ask for ransom, and use the ransom to invest that in all of the covert or all the covert actions that they were doing in the region. When they were in Angola, And they sent so many young kids from Cuba, and they were sent to fight in a war that had really no sense for Cubans to get involved. And what they did in Angola is that they became embedded once again in all of the trafficking of diamonds. They were very involved in the Middle East. Since the beginning, they were involved in the Middle East. And this goes to their entire mentality with the Soviet Union, right? They saw the Middle East as a place where they could turn against the West, against the US, and against Israel. It was the Cuban regime who introduced the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, into Latin America. It was not, then they developed this close relationship with Nicaragua, but it was Cuba who was behind all of these revolutions. This is very simple to understand when you look at the amount of embassies, for example, the Cuban regime has around the world. It has a disproportionate presence for its size and its GDP. And that is to the level of the United States and other big economies. Why? Because that's the way they maintain power. They collect a lot of intelligence on around the world, and they have made the United States their sole target. So when people tell me, well, it's not a threat, yeah, it's not going to do a land invasion in the United States. But what it's going to do, and what he has done throughout the years, is that because it is perceived as an underdog and nobody really pays attention or has paid attention to them for the past 30 years, they have been able to collect a lot of secrets, and not just political secrets, but also secrets of technology. And then they trade that for what they call their subsidies with our enemies, with Venezuela, with Russia, with Iran, through all of this oil, their subsidies. And they were very efficient. And then what they did after they lost the support of the Soviet Union, they moved to Venezuela, which was always a target of Castro. He tried to invade Venezuela even decades ago, and he failed. But Venezuela was always, it's the Saudi Arabia of Latin America. It was a source of increased economic support for Cuba for decades. It was very important for them. And they basically took over Venezuela. Exploited all of those resources, destroyed their country. They destroyed the same way they destroyed the island of Cuba, and simply to sustain the regime, because it was with Venezuelan oil that they pay for a lot of this, and a lot of the intelligence they provided to Venezuela in exchange of this oil, and promising that as long as you have us, you're never going to be invaded. The U.S. is never going to be able to take you out of power, because look at us. We have survived for 60 years.
Gelet, you've given us a really good overview of Cuban regime activity all over the world. You mentioned the Middle East. You've mentioned ETA in Spain. You've mentioned Venezuela now, the Soviets, and so on. I want to hone in a little bit on the Middle East question for a few reasons, but Cuba's played this role in the Middle East, as you mentioned. Most people probably don't know that Castro, for example, sent tanks to Syria to help former President Hafez al-Assad fight Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And that's just one example. Cuba continues to host, as you've reported previously, Palestinian militant groups and U.S. designated Palestinian terrorist organizations that are committed to the destruction of Israel. So, for example, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. Can you explain what is Cuba's objective here? You could talk about it generally, but what's their objective in the Middle East specifically as well?
Yes, as I said, and as you explained, they've always been very involved in the Middle East. The history of Cuba has always been embedded in the Middle East, and it is not simply ideological solidarity. Definitely, they have tried to bridge the gap and be like the connective tissue between this Red-Green alliance, which this extremist groups from the Middle East and the Marxists from the West. But the regime, it's important to understand what the Cuban regime really is. The Cuban regime and the Castro regime was a movement that was called 26 de Julio, July 26. And the way they took power, which is something that a lot of people sometimes forget, they acted like a terrorist organization. We didn't have those designations back in the days, but that's how they took power. Batista was a dictator. That's granted. Nobody disputes that. But what the Cuban regime did, the movement that Castro led, July 26, They place bombs in theaters. They kill innocent civilians. They place bombs in markets, completely destroyed and had zero disregard from human life. And I mean, it didn't matter. Okay, the means didn't matter as long as he could retain and gain power. And then when he gained power, he basically killed all the opposition, because that was not the only movement. There were other movements trying to fight Batista. And he began killing and taking over everyone, and everyone that was even a little bit popular, he would have him disappear. Since the beginning, that movement was supported by the Soviet Union, okay? He didn't become a communist later. The Communist Party in Cuba was active since the 1919 and then in 1930, and it had already a lot of experience in undercover and clandestine operations. So it did not have the support of the Cuban people, but that circle of the Communist Party was very well trained, had been in touch with the Soviet Union for a lot of time. And they're the ones that, according to some historians, they're the one that saw the Castro brothers, because Raúl Castro was a member of the Communist Party, as an opportunity to support this group with all of the intelligence, all of the experience that the Soviet Union had at the time, and infiltrate that movement and help them gain power, so the Soviet Union could turn the island in what it was trying to do and failed to do in other countries in Latin America, right? At the time, the Comintern and the Soviet Union was trying to infiltrate every single country, because it was the Cold War era. So they succeeded with Cuba. So those are two important things that we need to understand. These are two brothers that acted as thugs, but we have provided them with the legitimacy and the diplomatic immunity, and that we treat a real president. But the Cuban regime was always a terrorist organization. You know, what preceded the Cuban regime, the movement they come from, was acted as terrorist organization. So it's only reasonable to think that, okay, those are the movement, and that is the mentality they had, and that's the way they act. And the reason they align themselves and they have been able to move back a path from that is because they cannot compete militarily or economically with Washington, right? So they relied on those intelligence operations, in these influence networks, in these strategic alliances with anti-Western actors in order to expand geopolitical, to be relevant. Because who are they going to align themselves with? They cannot align themselves with a democratic country, because the reality is that this is a mafia state. So I think the mistake in the West and in Washington that I've seen is to think the Cuban regime is any different than the way and the mentality of a cartel or any other terrorist organization, right? And then at a point, they realize, okay, there is a way to get inside a country and take control by exploiting the democratic system. And then they began helping, for example, with all these peace agreements in Colombia, they began helping FARC and other terrorist groups to gain that political legitimacy, right? Because they realized that if we can take and exploit the democratic system with all of these active measures and propaganda mechanisms and platforms that we have, then we are even more protected, and we can take control of a country and state. And once we're there, we change the constitution and we stay. And that's what they have tried to do and help others do throughout the world. And they have succeeded in several countries in Latin America.
Can you talk a bit one of the things Trump talks about with Cuba and Marco Rubio is that we can't have sort of this anti-American base right below Florida. But it's not just that the stuff they're exporting. U.S. officials talk about how both China and Russia have really set up listening posts, espionage posts in Cuba to sort of basically, just be a listening post for everything going on in here. Can you talk a bit more about, there have been stories last year about the Chinese setting up a pretty big listening post, but what you know about those types of spying activities that the Chinese and the Russians do using Cuba as the base?
Yes. So the data we have, for us, is not new, because there's a lot of independent research on this issue for a long time. You have another site in Santiago de Cuba and sites near Bejucal, another town where there are listening posts and there are this military base. In fact, there are several GRU agents that have arrived to the island in recent years, and they did not. Usually, when you go through the embassy as a diplomat, you have to register. This never registered, and there was an investigation by a media site, The Intercept, where they uncovered all of these agents, some of them who were involved in extrajudicial killings around the world, etc., Novichok killings, and they have been stationed inside the island for a long time. Their kids are there studying in Cuba, very under the radar. This has gone through. This is not something that comes from this administration as an excuse. This is something that has been independently researched for a long time, and definitely is very sensitive because of how close we are to the United States. There's a region sensitive U.S. military infrastructure, such as Southcom in Miami or CENTCOM in Tampa, and all of the Cape Canaveral and even the Guantanamo Bay, where analysts see these facilities that they could potentially intercept communications, they can monitor military exercises, they can even track rocket launches and gather a lot of radar intelligence. So Russia has also maintained a long-standing intelligence relationship with Havana. We have to understand that this is not a relationship that was built 10 years ago. Dating back to the Cold War, this relationship was so close that, for example, when Cuba would collect intelligence from the United States, specifically technology, right? But the Cuban regime was not able to exploit this information, so they would give it to the Soviets. There was a Soviet agent that would always go once a month to the Cuban intelligence offices to collect all this data that Cuba did not have the technology to exploit. So you have this regime basically helping one of the biggest enemies of the United States to collect all of this intelligence in many different ways, to operate freely. And from there, from Havana, aside from all of the exporting all of this extremism, it also allows from these agents to move into the region. There are also reports of trainings being conducted in Cuba where the Cubans have trained people on how to infiltrate and cross the southern border. I think that is something that definitely requires a lot of more in-depth investigation. But I do see it as a threat. And the biggest threat is that it's very difficult to explain to the American people because of how underreported Cuba has been for the past 3 decades, how big of a threat it is, because they play it very carefully. So their hands are always clean, but they're like the ones providing and facilitating all of this to happen.
I think you're right that the Americans don't understand these threats because it does sound like Cold War relics, right? I want to hone in a little bit on this question about the threat to the United States specifically and how Cuba, how they're exploiting Americans who don't understand the threat posed by the regime. And you have, for example, just as an example, this past March, the Cuban government hosted a large delegation of left-wing American activists, including the podcaster, may I add troublemaker, Hassan Piker, and the daughter of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And they all went. There was a very public show. The group called for an end to U.S. sanctions on Cuba. They joined Cuban officials in attacking U.S. foreign policy in general. They also made quite a lush show of themselves, going around in cars and these vehicles and having a concert where they had full electricity while the rest of the island sat in the dark. So hypocritical at best is a polite way of mentioning it. But the thing is, it doesn't feel like a lot of folks here understand why that was so problematic. So can you talk about Cuba's long history of seeking to promote and incite left-wing activism inside the United States and how they do it?
Yes, well, definitely. The Cuban regime was, for example, instrumental in domestic terrorist groups in the United States, like the Weathermen Underground, and also some Puerto Rican terrorist groups that committed hideous crimes throughout the years. And that has been documented for decades. What happened is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the focus on Cuba ended, right? I think there was this sense globally that, okay, we we won, the threat of communism is gone. And then a lot of people were told that communism was no longer a threat, that somehow it had changed, it had reformed itself into something less confrontational, less hideous. And under this mentality, for the past 30 years, what we have seen is that this regime, the nature of this regimes was not transformed, and they continue to operate, but with a lot of more less scrutiny. Let's put it that way. One of the issues is that because of how connected we are today, because how accessible information it is today, that they have been able to exploit also the democratic system. And if you look at every terrorist group around the world have their own media platform, right? They're always they have radio shows. They're always trying to influence, because they understand, especially in the United States with all of our freedoms, that public opinion matters. And when you have a protest in New York, right, there's people that are going to think, it's a bunch of crazy people. But when you have all of the mainstream media covering, you in a way, you're putting pressure into those politicians, right, that have to go to an election, that have to that are accountable to their country, unlike in an authoritarian regime. So definitely they have exploited that. Now, I think the big story with this, and what our counterintelligence and law enforcement perhaps owe the American people, because a lot of information about Cuba hasn't been declassified since, 1980 something. We declassified something in the 2000s that was from the 80s. So there's not a lot of information that has been declassified. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the shadow, but they're not being, the story is not being told. And what we need to explain is that this is not people who simply have ideological sympathies. Okay, this is not what we're talking about. I understand that in the United States, you can think the way you want, right? And you should not be persecuted for thinking the way you want. Even if you're a communist, even if you support any type of extreme speech, right? I get it. But what's happening in Havana is not ideological sympathies, okay? What is happening in Havana, and what I have documented, and I have discussed this with Jay in the past, is that, for example, let's put the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine just as one little example. They began a branch in 2017 in Cuba, okay? This branch has embedded itself in all of these activist groups that travel constantly to Cuba. They interact, they participate in workshops, they know each other, they follow each other. So you have all of these extreme ideas from around the world that then are going back to their country. They're banned. If it's the topic is we're talking is the Middle East, okay, then they vandalize, for example, Jewish business. You look at a lot of the protests against the Elbit system, which is a military entity owned by Israel. And a lot of the protesters behind that in the US have all traveled to Havana. Okay, then you have entities in the United States that are registered on the 501c3, but they are co-founder or members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine living in Havana, are part of these entities, right? And then it becomes a little bit more muddy, right? It's not just ideological, because there are laws in the United States that prevent from providing material support to terrorist groups. And material support is not just financial support, even coordinating advocacy. When you're trying to provide legitimacy to a terrorist group, when you're trying to sanitize this level of violence, right? And legitimize this violence, you are providing material support to terrorist organizations. And I think that's the big question for law enforcement. And then you're also allowing, not everyone that travels to Havana is going to end up being recruited, but you're allowing terrorist organizations to have more encounters with malcontent Americans, with very young kids, sometimes 17 years old, that are very impressionable, that they don't understand a lot about history. And then you're providing all of these regimes like Iran. This is exactly what Cuba did with Iran in Latin America. You are providing them with access to these networks that are already disenchanted, they're very young, that they could potentially recruit and radicalize. And there's a lot of information. The last disclosure of this is, or discussion about this happened in 2015 in Congress. We haven't had a serious discussion about this issue since then. But even the discussion back then, 10 years ago, was that Cuba had given Iran It was providing Iran with the intelligence to penetrate and create networks inside Latin America, because Iran lacked the cultural expertise in the region, right? Nothing more distant from a Hispanic country than Iran, right? So a Shia theocracy, there was no conversion point. So what the Cuban regime did is that it helped Iran with all of its solidarity movement, all of its network that had cultivated throughout the years. It helped them with all of this intelligence, how to create cultural centers, media sites. And that is why when you look at the people, even inside the US, in my assessment, that are helping Iran with their propaganda, you see a big number of activists that are also longtime Cuban regime solidarity activists, because Havana recruited them for decades. And when Iran needed those people, when it began paying attention into this region, who was the partner to allow to basically lease, in a way, Iran all of this network? It was Cuba. It was not China. It was not Russia. It was the Cuban regime. And the overlap is it's out there. It's very easy to track.
Can you talk a bit? One group that gets a lot of focus in the US nowadays is called the Singham Network, which is led by this American tech billionaire who lives in Shanghai and is essentially seen as working with the Chinese Communist Party. But it's got a lot of different, it's got a political party, a media arm, and then activist groups, particularly Code Pink, I would think gets the most attention. Doesn't Code Pink have particularly strong ties to the Cuban regime and the Singham Network in general?
Yes, that's a very good case study, right? Because it's not just Code Pink. For example, Archie Singham, which was Roy Neville Singham father, right?
This is the founder of the Singham Network, yeah.
Correct. He's the founder of this network, the guy that has all this money. But his dad was a close ally of the Cuban regime. He was spotted, according to former Cuban officials that I've interviewed, that were stationed at the United Nations. Cuba has a mission in the UN. 90% of that mission is people believed, like counterintelligence believed, that 90% are Cuban intelligence. And they have a lot of mobility, a lot of flexibility to recruit from New York. Not really so much like the Washington embassy, because they had some restriction to move around the US. But yes, the people in the UN mission. So I interviewed someone who met Archie, and it was a very close friend of Archie Singham. And Archie was a very famous academic of the non-alignment movement. And Cuba began building a lot of ties with the non-alignment movement and all of this network of academic. So what we see in the Singham Network is the result of a lot of political socialization, right? Some of them are the kids of others who were close to the Cuban regime, right? And then you have Jody Evans, who worked with McGovern, who ran for president years ago, who was a very close ally of Castro, whose first husband was also very close to the Cuban regime and advocated for the Cuban regime. So it's an entire network that comes from this world. Many of them come from the years of the Vietnam War. They traveled to Vietnam, etc. So you have then other cases within this network. For example, Medalla Benjamin met the Cubans in Angola when the Cubans were in Angola, and she was there, and that's how they met. And then they invited her to Havana. Medalla left for years in Havana. She worked as a journalist in Havana, which might be true, but we also have to take into account, based on interviews I have conducted and even people who met her at the time, there are a lot of people who were suspicious of that position, because when you go to the island and you stay for many years and you're working with the Cuban regime, sometimes one of the covers they use is they put you as a journalist, right? Because they need a cover. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm saying that the people that knew her, that I have interviewed in the past, and the pattern we see in Cuba has been that. So this is a source of concern for many people. And then you have Medalla, but you have all other members on the coping board, like Vivienne Lesnick. She is the daughter of Max Lesnick, a long ally of Castro. In fact, when you saw the indictment this week, yep. Right? Last week, we indicted Raul Castro. It was done by because of the shooting of Brothers to the Rescue. Let me tell you a little story. Before Brothers to the Rescue, right around that time, there was a big negotiation between Havana and the Clinton administration. Max Lesnick was part of that negotiation. Clinton was willing to remove the sanctions at the time because we didn't have the Libertad Act, so the sanctions were not law, were not statute at the time. It was easy for any president to remove them, and Clinton was willing to do that. While they were having this relationship, Castro decided to shut down Brothers to the Rescue because he wanted, and this is what some people that were part of those negotiations have told me, that he really wanted to sabotage having a good relationship with the United States because it was not in his interest to have a good relationship with the United States and lose the antagonist, right, in front of the Cuban people, because that antagonism, that constant war was beneficial for him politically, for this scare tactic internally. So when you see that you have several members of COPINC, several members of the Singham Network, Manolo de los Santos, for those who haven't follow him, he's an executive on the Singham Network, executive on the People's Forum, an organization that has been organizing a lot of protests around the country, an executive in the Justice and Education Fund, another nonprofit that is tied to Singham. De los Santos was spotted by a group that is called Pastor for Peace, by this Marxist pastor in New York, to travel to Havana when he was very young. He then lived in Havana for many years. They said he studied there at a religious seminary in Matanzas. But Mr. de los Santos, I think he arrived in Cuba. If he wasn't 17, he was around 18, also at a very young age. Has a very close relationship with the Cuban regime. I interviewed a Cuban journalist who actually saw him at an office in Cuba when he arrived to Havana. He was the one organizing all the movement and the advocacy campaign for the release of the other spies that were in the United States. Mr. de los Santos used, according to the testimony of this gentleman that I've interviewed and another journalist, he used to go to this office as part of this international committee that was promoting this campaign to release the WASP network. So long story short, when you look at all of this pattern, Jay and Hagar, and you also did the story about Kala Walsh, also arrived to Cuba at 17. When you look at Claudia de la Cruz from Party of Socialism and Liberation, also said that her activism got stronger when she visited Cuba. When you look at Gloria La Riva, also part of the Cuba Solidarity Network, I mean, the list is so long that it's overwhelming. So the entire network has a very close relationship with Cuba because they either live there, they have been part of the solidarity movement for a long time, and anyone who understands how the regime operates knows that this solidarity movement is a big part of Cubans' intelligence assets, because that's how they recruit. The moment that the passports are sent to Cuba, they start analyzing, profiling those activists. I'm not saying everyone that travels to the island ends up working for them, but that is the goal for them. The goal is that if you're a person of interest, if you're a journalist, and all of a sudden you have access to a lot of people in the U.S., you are ideologically you are sympathetic of them. Of course, they're going to try to recruit you because you're a valuable asset, and that is not a secret for anyone. So anyone that is traveling to Cuba and has that strong, close relationship with Cuban authorities, with Cuban intelligence, I think it should be a source of concern for the United States. My concern with this is that the Singham Network, it's more than an ideological hub for Marxism and anti-capitalism. There are a lot of extreme actors that I have identified at some of the meetings that are taking place and orbiting around this network. And this is the story I'm about to publish. And I think those are issues that should be addressed in this country.
So, Gelet, you're getting me thinking about the heart of all of this, which is, what would the fall of the Castro regime mean for U.S. national security and the broader Caribbean and Latin America region?
I think it's going to be a source of stability for Latin America. Cuba has been distressing, and it has been destabilizing Latin America for a long time. So I'm very happy for the domino effect that this is going to have in the region. Once this intelligence apparatus is no longer has the diplomatic immunity that they enjoy, I think the threat that the United States is going to have to mitigate is that what are they going to do with this intelligence apparatus that is so sophisticated to prevent them from inserting themselves into the drug trafficking and into money laundering and those types of activities. But definitely it's going to be positive in that sense. I also have to be honest, aside from ideologically where I stand or anything, look, I'm a mom. I have a kid that is 14 years old. And when I see a lot of these young people, 17, who I know they're just ignorant a lot about my country, right? And they're going to my country to hear this very well crafted propaganda, and you can drink this Kool-Aid, because you don't have a lot of information, you didn't live, and they have crafted this for 60 years, so it's very well constructed. So I'm very concerned about the lives of Americans that could be radicalized, that sometimes we know that Cuba had a hand on it, but sometimes we don't even know. And I'm pretty sure that we have people in counterintelligence and even insider intelligence that know that this has happened, that Cuba's hands has been behind the radicalization and some of the things that have occurred in the last few decades, but we don't have the data publicly. It hasn't been disclosed. And I think there should be a cause of concern for Americans, like why American kids at 17, 18 are traveling to this country to be exploited by this authoritarian regime who violates every single human rights in the book. That it's really atrocious. This is not about, oh, maybe I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, we disagree. No. Those are disagreements that we can discuss and we can solve, and they're not deal breaker. What is happening in Cuba is really people that are made believe they have grievances against the system, and those grievances are being exploited to go against the system, to break the law, to vandalize, and to really put themselves on a position where they can end up in prison. That it's one thing that could happen. The other thing is that they end up committing domestic terrorist crimes, like it has happened in the past. And so definitely I think that a lot of things are going to change when this platform for our enemies to freely operate 90 miles from our shores is closed for business, and the United States become an ally of not just the Cuban people, because the United States has always been an ally of the Cuban people. No other country has helped us at the United States government. But even though the political will sometimes was lacking, but the truth is that it has always helped the democracy movement in Cuba. But I'm eager to see what it's going to be of the region, what's going to happen when it's also going to be able to be an ally of a democratic government in Cuba.
And final question. How is this transition going to work? Is there some power? Is there some person like in Venezuela that we could ally with, or is this going to be a massive kind of effort, bringing Cubans back from Florida, working with the kind of the disaffected elements inside Cuba? How would a transition work?
Well, I think a transition is possible, but it's not going to be automatic. I don't think it's going to be that difficult, or that it's portrayed as bringing people out from Florida. There's a lot of big, important actors in the democracy movement, and even business people who are eager to go and help reconstruct the island and contribute to a democratic Cuba. I think the danger is a controlled secession where the military and these intelligence services and their elites that are linked to the regime preserve power under a new phase. And I'm a little bit more optimistic now than what I was a few months ago, because I saw them presenting a lot of options to Washington, a lot of so-called Delcy Rodriguez. We have to understand that what happened in Venezuela is not necessarily the same scenario for Cuba, right? We have similar issues, but it's very different country, right? In Cuba, there are no political parties. There is not a position that is able to even run for office, right? Because it's a one-party system. Cuba is more, actually, it's probably similar to Iran. in the sense of how authoritarian it is, right? Without obviously the military capabilities that Iran has, right? So I think in the case of Cuba, the real danger is in that elites to stay in power under a new phase. I think the administration, in my opinion, should help and support this democracy organizations and civil society. There's a lot of documents that need to be preserved in Cuba in order to have legal accountability, because this is a country that we're gonna need a process of legal accountability if we really want to heal as a nation and we want to move forward, because there are a lot of crimes that have been committed that nobody has paid for that, right? So we need a process in that direction also. I don't see Adelcy Rodriguez as an easy solution for us. And the difference perhaps I see between us and Venezuela, we don't have the networks inside the country that Venezuela has, right? The networks are outside, but inside the country, we don't have the same situation. The level of support for the regime, like I said, it's virtually non-existent. The other thing is that the diaspora outside Cuba has a lot of political influence, right? We've been here for a long time. We have people in Congress, people in the Senate. So I think a fake transition or a transition that lasts too long with a figurehead is not going to be well received. But Cubans in the U.S. we do have political capital in this country. So I don't see a path for Adelcy Rodriguez like that. I believe there should be maybe a commission of a transition, an administrative government with very small, with people that are involved in that government and not allowed to run for elections the next cycle. So we protect that, the integrity of a future democratic system. And the only path is just to follow the law. Everything in the transition for Cuba is statute, is in the Libertad Act, is drafted there, and there are very specific steps that the Cuban regime or a transition government needs to take in order for the embargo to be lifted, right? Release of political prisoners, legalization of political parties, a timetable for free elections, and a clear process to pay the debt the Cuban regime has with American business and business that are on the Helms board. And those are business that were expropriated. And we're talking about a debt that goes in the billions now. So the Cuban regime or the transition government, that this administrative government needs to have a clear path in order to solve those issues. So that is why I don't see Adelcy Rodriguez as a solution. The Venezuelans did not have this in statute. We do have the transition. It's in the law. And it's going to be very difficult for the administration to circumvent the law.
Well, Gelet, this has been fantastic, a tour de force. We appreciate it. Where can our listeners find your work, your writings, your investigations?
Well, they can follow us on social media. We have a website that is called ADN Cuba, adncuba.com, like Cuba's DNA. And we publish a lot of the human rights crisis inside the island there. And they can also follow me in social media. Not very good on social media, but I'm also there. It's Gelet Martinez in X. And they'll be very happy if they follow us and start reading about what's happening inside the island. And thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Gelet, for joining us. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. If you are so inclined, please leave us a review, and preferably 5 stars. It makes a huge difference in helping new listeners find us. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, you guys.